On June 27, 1876, mounted soldiers crossed the hills east of the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. They were searching for Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and 5 companies of the Seventh Cavalry. The men had been out of contact since the afternoon of June 25th, but before the soldiers saw a single body, they smelled the dead. The odor drifted across the grassland beneath the June sun. It was sickly sweet, thick, and so heavy that many men pulled scarves tightly over their mouths. Some soldiers gagged in their saddles, while others stopped and refused to move any farther. Then they saw pale shapes scattered across the hillsides. From a distance, the shapes looked like light-colored rocks lying among the sunburned grass. As the column moved closer, those rocks became the naked bodies of men stripped of their clothing. Their skin had turned pale beneath the sun, and their limbs rested at angles that no longer belonged to the living. Many faces had been destroyed so completely that they could no longer be recognized. Some bodies were missing hands, feet, or heads. One man had an arrow driven into his eye socket, while another had his face crushed by a stone club. Others had their chests cut open. Severed fingers lay across the grass like coins, dropped by someone moving in a hurry. Of the more than 200 men who rode with Custer, only a small number could be identified by face, uniform, or bodily markings. Tom Custer, George Custer's brother and a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient, was identified only by a tattoo and letters on his arm. The others were so badly damaged that comrades who had eaten, slept, and marched beside them could not correctly name them. All of this happened during a single afternoon. Some accounts say Custer's 5 companies were destroyed in less than 1 hour. The final stage may have lasted only about 30 minutes. In the time it takes someone to finish lunch, 210 United States Army soldiers disappeared as a fighting force. No one from Custer's immediate command survived to describe the final moments. There was no after-action report, no officer's testimony, and no wounded soldier who returned to explain what happened on the ridges. From the moment the final messenger left Custer, the story of those 5 companies entered the silence of the dead. But their deaths were only half the story. The other half lay in what happened after the gunfire stopped. Women elders and others from the Lakota and Cheyenne camp then entered the battlefield. The actions witnessed by the burial party 2 days later were not entirely random violence, yet they remained horrifying to anyone who saw them. To many 19th century Americans, the scene could be explained by only one word: savagery. But for some Lakota and Cheyenne, damaging an enemy's body carried meanings of revenge trophies and spiritual warfare. To understand Little Bighorn, one must accept that the same act could appear criminal to one side and protective to the other. Custer was found near the crest of the hill, later named Last Stand Hill. His body had 2 bullet wounds, one in the head and another in the left side of his chest. Yet his body was far less damaged than many of those around him. No one knows which bullet killed him when he died or who brought him down. For decades, Americans asked which warrior had killed George Armstrong Custer. A Northern Cheyenne oral tradition, widely publicized in 2005, suggested Buffalo Calf Road woman may have struck him with a club. 8 days earlier, she had ridden into gunfire to rescue her brother during the Battle of the Rosebud. The story cannot be proven as a forensic conclusion, but it has endured within Cheyenne memory. The familiar image of Little Bighorn shows Custer on a hill with a sword in his hand and long blonde hair blowing behind him. His soldiers form a circle around him, but Custer carried no sword on June 25, 1876, and his hair had been cut short. Battlefield evidence also reveals no complete defensive circle. Instead of an orderly last stand, cartridge cases and body locations show lines being divided and broken apart. They eventually became small groups of men attempting to flee. The true ending may not have occurred on the crest of Last Stand Hill. Below it lies Deep Ravine, a steep cut descending toward the river. About 28 bodies were found clustered there. Those soldiers may have been running toward water, an escape route, or Reno and Benteen's force. But they never crossed that ravine. A wounded horse named Comanche was found near the place where Captain Miles Keogh had fallen. It carried several wounds from bullets and arrows, but remained alive within the area where Custer's companies were destroyed. Comanche was later treated, retired, and displayed before the Seventh Cavalry with an empty saddle on its back. The empty saddle became the perfect symbol for the story America wanted to tell. A heroic commander had died with all his men during a noble last stand against overwhelming numbers. But symbols are always simpler than the truth. And the truth about Little Bighorn began years before Custer rode into the valley. It began with an officer who understood the power of fame. It continued with a military conviction that should have ended his command career, but ultimately failed to do so. And it led to a question more frightening than who killed Custer. Why was a man like him still given the power to decide the fate of hundreds of people? The man who might never have been allowed to command again. George Armstrong Custer was born on December 5, 1839 in New Rumley, Ohio. When the American Civil War began in 1861, he had just graduated near the bottom of his class at West Point. Only 2 years later, at age 23, he was promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers. He became one of the youngest generals in the Union Army. Custer built his reputation through daring cavalry charges. He often appeared before his soldiers with long blonde hair, a red scarf, and a uniform designed to make him stand out. To Custer, war was not only a place to win battles, it was also a stage where a man could create his own legend. During the Civil War, that boldness repeatedly produced results. Custer moved quickly, accepted risks, and transferred his confidence to the men who followed him. But traits that created an effective commander in a large war could become dangerous when caution was replaced by speed and willpower. When the Civil War ended in April 1865, Custer's volunteer general's rank did not guarantee an equal position in the peacetime army. He returned to a lower rank in the regular army. He was eventually appointed lieutenant colonel of the newly formed Seventh Cavalry Regiment. Colonel Samuel Sturgis was the official commander, but Custer often led the regiment directly in the field. By 1867, the 7th Cavalry was campaigning across the Great Plains under General Winfield Scott Hancock. Marching conditions were severe, the soldiers were inexperienced, horses were exhausted, and desertions increased rapidly. Custer responded with harsh discipline, but his methods soon crossed the limits the army was willing to accept. During the summer of 1867, several soldiers deserted while the regiment moved across Kansas. Custer ordered them pursued and allowed troops to fire on them. Some deserters were wounded or killed without trial. The survivors were initially denied medical treatment, a decision later included among the charges against Custer. But the most serious act directly involved Custer himself. While stationed at Fort Wallace, Kansas, he left his unit without proper permission. He traveled hundreds of miles to see his wife Elizabeth Libby Custer. During a campaign in which soldiers could be punished or shot for desertion, their commander abandoned his position without authority. Custer did not formally desert the army, and the incident did not occur in Oklahoma as some modern accounts incorrectly claim. He was charged with being absent from his command without permission. He was also accused of conduct harmful to military order and abusing his authority against deserters. The difference in terminology did not make the action less serious. He had abandoned his command during an active campaign. The court-martial began at Fort Leavenworth in September 1867. Custer was convicted on the principal charges. He was suspended from rank command and pay for 1 year. For an officer who lived through fame and action, it was more than a professional punishment. It was a public humiliation. During the suspension, Custer had no authority to lead troops in battle. Newspapers that once praised the golden-haired general now had reason to question his discipline and judgment. A career that had advanced with extraordinary speed appeared to have reached its first limit. But the sentence did not last the full year. On September 24, 1868, about 2 months before the suspension ended, General Philip Sheridan returned Custer to command. He was recalled to lead the 7th Cavalry during a winter campaign against Cheyenne communities on the southern Great Plains. Sheridan was fully aware of what Custer had done. The 1867 conviction was an official Army matter, not an unverified accusation or rumor. But Sheridan believed Custer possessed the experience, energy, and cavalry leadership the coming campaign required. Many officers in the regiment also supported his return. Custer divided opinion among commanders, but he could make soldiers march rapidly and attack aggressively. During a winter campaign where speed was considered decisive, those qualities outweighed the warnings raised by his conviction. Restoring Custer did not mean the Army declared him innocent. It meant powerful men decided that his experience mattered more than forcing him to complete his punishment. It was a practical decision. But practical military decisions are often paid for with the lives of people who had no part in making them. Only 2 months after returning, Custer led the 7th Cavalry against a Cheyenne village on November 27, 1868. The village stood along the Washita River in what is now Oklahoma. The Army described the attack as a victory over hostile forces, but women, children, and elders were also inside the camp. Debates over the number of non-combatants killed and the nature of the attack continued to follow Custer's reputation. At Washita, Major Joel Elliott and a group of soldiers left the main force to pursue people fleeing the village. Elliott and the 17 men accompanying him were surrounded and killed. Custer withdrew without immediately organizing a search for them. Captain Frederick Benteen, Elliott's close friend, never forgot that decision. The hostility between Benteen and Custer began with the deaths at Washita and continued for years. Benteen viewed Custer as a commander willing to endanger others to protect his speed reputation and plans. 8 years later, Benteen would receive Custer's final message at Little Bighorn. It cannot be said that Sheridan's decision to restore Custer in 1868 directly caused the disaster of June 25, 1876. Nearly 8 years separated the events, along with several campaigns, government decisions, and military failures. But without his return to command, Custer might never have led 5 companies onto the hills east of Little Bighorn. The remarkable point is not that the Army failed to understand Custer. Officials knew he was bold, ambitious, impatient, and had violated rules he enforced against his own soldiers. They still decided those qualities could be useful during America's westward expansion. By the summer of 1876, Custer was 36 years old, and the glory of the Civil War was beginning to fade. He had once been one of the most famous officers in America. Now his name was tied to political controversy, a court-martial, and criticism from officers within his own regiment. He needed a victory large enough to remind the country that George Armstrong Custer still deserved attention. Some historians believe Custer may have hoped to enter politics, or even play a role in the 1876 presidential election. Evidence for that specific ambition remains disputed. But his desire to restore his reputation is difficult to deny. Little Bighorn appeared when he needed a fast, decisive victory large enough to return his name to the front pages. Custer entered the 1876 campaign as a man who had already been warned about the consequences of reckless decisions. He had been convicted, suspended, forgiven early, and returned to command because powerful men accepted the risk of his talent. That experience may have taught him a dangerous lesson. If you won, every limit could be ignored. But this time Custer was not advancing toward a force already falling apart. He was approaching thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho gathered beside the Little Bighorn River. The crisis that brought him there began with another expedition. It began when Custer himself led Americans into land they had promised never to invade. Gold was found on land that had been promised protection from intrusion. On April 29, 1868, representatives of the United States government and several Sioux leaders signed the Fort Laramie Treaty. The agreement was signed in what is now Wyoming and established the Great Sioux Reservation. It included all of present-day western South Dakota and the Black Hills, the sacred mountains the Lakota called Pahasapa. On paper, the region was reserved for Sioux use and occupation, protected from intrusion by white settlers. The treaty was not a gift voluntarily offered by the government. It followed years of warfare, especially Red Cloud's War. Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors repeatedly attacked military posts along the Bozeman Trail. By 1868, the United States agreed to close the forts and admitted it could not yet control the Powder River region by force. To the Lakota, the Black Hills were not merely hunting grounds or land that could be bought and sold. They were the spiritual center of the world, tied to origin ceremonies, ancestral memory, and ancient stories. A government might see forests, mountains, and minerals, but the Lakota saw an inseparable part of themselves. The 1868 treaty also recognized a vast area outside the reservation as unceded hunting territory. The Lakota and their allies could continue traveling hunting buffalo and camping there while the herds remained sufficient. This was the same region where many communities later gathered beside the Little Bighorn River. But promises on the Great Plains often lasted only until Americans discovered something they wanted. Railroads, farmland, and trade routes repeatedly pushed treaty boundaries farther west. The Black Hills remained protected not because the promise was strong, but because few white Americans yet considered war worthwhile. That changed in 1874. That summer, George Armstrong Custer was ordered to lead a military expedition into the Black Hills. Its mission was to survey the terrain, locate possible fort sites, and evaluate the region's natural resources. The man who would die at Little Bighorn 2 years later led troops across the border of treaty-protected land. On July 2, 1874, the expedition left Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. Custer traveled with more than 1,000 soldiers, scouts, engineers, scientists, drivers, and reporters. A supply train several miles long accompanied them. This was not a group that accidentally wandered onto sacred land. It was an organized force, protected by the United States Army. Custer understood that the expedition would attract intense attention from the press. Reporters described green valleys, clear water, open grasslands, and forests capable of supplying lumber for towns. Their reports presented the Black Hills not as Lakota land, but as a frontier waiting for Americans to develop. Then, members of the expedition found gold. The first traces appeared near French Creek in late July 1874. Miners traveling with the expedition quickly confirmed that precious metal existed in the streambed. The amount initially discovered was small, but that no longer mattered. News of the gold escaped the Black Hills faster than the expedition could return. Newspapers described the region as a rich land lying beyond American reach. In reality, the treaty already recognized it as belonging to another people. Within months, the promise made in 1868 was being weighed against the value of the metal beneath the ground. Custer returned as the man who had brought news of a major discovery. Reports of the expedition restored his public image and opened the door to an invasion the Army knew was coming. People no longer asked whether miners would enter the Black Hills. They asked how quickly they would arrive. In the spring of 1875, prospectors began crossing the reservation boundary in increasing numbers. They built camps dug into the earth, cut down trees, and renamed streams and mountains that already had Lakota names. Every new tent became evidence that the government had no intention of enforcing its own promise. The Army was occasionally ordered to remove the intruders. Some miners were arrested, camps were dismantled, and several parties were escorted out of the Black Hills. But they quickly returned by different routes. The government had enough troops to remove small groups, but lacked the political will to confront thousands seeking gold. This was the crucial difference. When Lakota people lived outside the reservation, the government described them as a threat that had to be controlled. When white miners invaded forbidden territory, the government treated their actions as a problem requiring negotiation. By the middle of 1875, Washington began searching for a way to purchase the Black Hills. A delegation met Lakota representatives and offered either to buy the land or lease its mineral rights. But placing a monetary value on sacred land made the negotiation itself an insult. Many Lakota leaders refused to sell. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and others outside the reservation system rejected anyone's authority to sell land belonging to all. To them, the Black Hills were not private property that one person could sign away and transfer to another. The failure of negotiations did not cause the government to abandon its intention to seize the region. It merely caused Washington to change its methods. When it could not purchase the Black Hills through a widely accepted agreement, it created conditions for military action. On November 3, 1875, President Ulysses S. Grant met senior officials at the White House to discuss the Black Hills. After the meeting, the Army stopped actively preventing prospectors from entering the region. The door had effectively been opened even though the treaty had not officially been canceled. This was the moment the betrayal became unmistakable. The government did not publicly declare the Fort Laramie Treaty invalid. Doing so would have exposed its policy before the entire nation. Instead, it simply stopped protecting the land it had promised to protect. Meanwhile, many Lakota groups continued living and hunting outside the reservation as the treaty had allowed. They followed the buffalo, established seasonal camps, and met relatives throughout the Powder River region. Their refusal to live year-round near government agencies did not make them rebels. But from Washington's perspective, those independent communities became the final obstacle. As long as Sitting Bull Crazy Horse and other leaders lived beyond government control, the region was not subdued. As long as they traveled freely, the seizure of the Black Hills still threatened to produce another war. On December 6, 1875, the Bureau of Indian Affairs ordered Lakota groups outside the reservation to report to government agencies. The deadline was January 31, 1876, less than 2 months after the order was issued. Anyone failing to arrive before that date would be classified as resisting government authority. The order came during winter on the Great Plains. Communities hundreds of miles away had to move teepees, elders, women, children, and thousands of horses through deep snow. Temperatures could fall below freezing. Even groups willing to comply might not receive the notice or complete the journey by January 31. The deadline was not designed to create a safe process of relocation. It created an administrative excuse to transform people living in their homeland into enemies of the state. When January 1876 ended, the government could claim it had offered the Lakota a choice, and they had refused. But the Lakota did not believe they were resisting a government with unquestionable legal authority over the territory. They remembered the Fort Laramie Treaty and the promises concerning the Black Hills. They also remembered that white miners had been the first to cross the boundary. From their perspective, the Army was not enforcing the law. It was arriving to complete an act of dispossession. In February 1876, the government officially classified the groups that had not reported as hostile. The Army began preparing a campaign of several columns to locate, surround, and force them to surrender. Communities once guaranteed hunting rights by treaty became military targets for continuing their traditional way of life. The language mattered enormously. Calling them hostile made the coming campaign appear to be an operation to restore order. It concealed the fact that the Army was attacking people resisting the seizure of their homeland. Once the label was applied, every military action that followed could be described as necessary. Custer again appeared at the center of the story. In 1874, he led the expedition that confirmed gold existed in the Black Hills. In 1876, he became one of the officers assigned to pursue those who refused to leave the land America now desired. There was a bitter circle in the entire affair. Custer entered the Black Hills under Army protection and returned east with news of gold. 2 years later, he led troops against people trying to keep that land. He did not create the entire policy, but his career connected its beginning to its bloody conclusion. In March 1876, the campaign's first military attack began. Colonel Joseph Reynolds led troops against a Cheyenne village along the Powder River. He believed it might be Crazy Horse's camp. American soldiers destroyed teepees, seized horses, and burned property, but failed to end the resistance. The attack produced the opposite result. Families that had lost shelter, food, and horses were forced to seek protection among larger groups. Instead of breaking the communities apart, the campaign pushed them closer together. During the spring of 1876, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and some Arapaho people gathered in an expanding camp. They came to hunt buffalo, perform ceremonies, meet relatives, and seek protection from approaching Army columns. Not everyone came to fight. but everyone understood that soldiers were searching for them. By June 1876, the camp stood along the Little Bighorn River. Thousands lived in hide teepees, while horse herds spread across the lowlands. Smoke from countless fires rose among the cottonwood trees. This was the community Custer would see from the ridges on June 25th. But something important happened before Custer arrived. On June 17, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors stopped General George Crook's column at the Rosebud. They forced him to withdraw from the campaign at a decisive moment. 8 days later, Custer advanced without fully knowing that the Southern column was no longer moving forward. Little Bighorn therefore did not begin with a gunshot on the ridge. It began when the government decided that gold was worth more than a signature on a treaty. Everything that followed was the Army's method of turning that decision into reality. When Custer rode toward the village in June 1876, he believed he was confronting groups declared hostile by the government. The families below saw troops sent after miners, invaded their land, and the government refused to remove them. The two sides entered battle with entirely different stories about who had violated the law. To Washington, the campaign would force resisting groups back onto the reservation. To the Lakota and Cheyenne, it was a defense against a government that had broken its promise. The government then used the Army to punish those who refused to accept the consequences. That difference shaped how each side fought, remembered, and later decided who deserved to be called a hero. Custer had not yet seen the village, but he had helped create the conditions that brought it to Little Bighorn. News of gold attracted miners. Miners created pressure to seize land, and that pressure transformed defenders into military targets. Custer was now riding into the final stage of a crisis his 1874 expedition had helped ignite. Beyond the ridges was not a military unit waiting for orders to attack. It was a gathering of thousands, including elders, women, children, and families. They had assembled under the protection of leaders such as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Custer believed he was searching for a hostile camp. What awaited him was an entire people. It was not a military camp. It was an entire people. By late June 1876, the camp beside the Little Bighorn River had become one of the largest plains gatherings in decades. Hide Tip is stretched nearly 3 miles along the lowlands, between cottonwoods, tall grass, and bends in the river. From the eastern ridges, the camp resembled a city of hidewood and cooking smoke rising from the open grasslands. Modern studies often estimate that between 6,000 and 8,000 people live there. About 1,500 to 2,000 may have been capable of fighting, though not all entered the battle at the same time. Most of the camp's residents were women, children, elders, and families traveling with the buffalo herds. This was the detail military planners in Washington failed to understand. On paper, they were pursuing groups officially declared hostile. But beside the Little Bighorn River was not an army waiting in camp for a battle. It was an entire people. The camp included many Lakota groups, including the Hunkpapa, Oglala, Miniconjou, Sanzark, Two Kettle Brûlé, and Blackfeet Lakota. Northern Cheyenne and a small number of Arapaho people were also present. Each community established its own area while maintaining its leaders' councils and family relationships. The teepee circles were not arranged randomly. They reflected social order kinship ties and the place of each group within community life. Open spaces at the center of each area were used for meeting ceremonies, tending horses, and preparing food. Every morning, smoke from thousands of cooking fires rose above the trees. Women raised and repaired teepees, prepared meat, cared for children, and worked animal hides. Men hunted, watched the horses, or joined councils, while children ran between the lodges. They did not know that an army force was advancing toward them. Horse herds covered the land beside the river. They provided transportation, wealth, prestige, and the means of survival for every family. From a distance, thousands of brown, black, and white horses moved across the grass like a vast carpet, flowing in sunlight. The enormous horse herds were among the first signs that alarmed Custer's scouts. A small camp could not own enough horses to make the horizon itself appear to move. But Custer still had not seen everything his scouts already understood. The village had not formed solely to prepare for one battle. Many families came to hunt buffalo, reunite with relatives, and attend important summer ceremonies. They also came because living within a large community offered protection from army columns entering the Powder River region. After Colonel Joseph Reynolds attacked in March 1876, many Cheyenne families lost their teepees, horses, and food. They sought protection among larger Lakota groups because an isolated family could not resist the army. Campaigns designed to scatter the communities ultimately drove them closer together. This was the first paradox of the 1876 campaign. The army believed constant pressure would force small groups to surrender separately. Instead, each attack taught the free communities that safety existed only when they stayed together. By June, the camp beside the Little Bighorn could no longer be easily driven away. It possessed enough warriors, horses, food, and space to respond to a major attack. What Custer saw as an enormous target was the direct result of the campaign intended to destroy resistance. The most influential spiritual figure in the camp was Sitting Bull, a Hunkpapa Lakota man, about 45 years old. He was not a supreme commander who could order every warrior like a United States Army general. His authority came from courage, personal reputation, public speaking, and his sacred role within community life. Sitting Bull had resisted American expansion for many years. He rejected constant supervision by government agencies and denied that a small group could sell the Black Hills for an entire people. To him, living freely beyond the reservation was not rebellion, but the continuation of an existing right. In early June 1876, while the camp gathered in the Rosebud region, Sitting Bull participated in the Sundance. During the ceremony, he offered pieces of flesh from his arms, danced in the heat, and fasted until nearly exhausted. After many hours, he experienced a vision that those around him would remember for years. In the vision, soldiers fell upside down from the sky into the camp. Their hats fell away, and their bodies descended like grasshoppers swept from the sky. They had no ears. Sitting Bull understood that the army would come and be defeated. The detail that they had no ears carried a frightening meaning. It could mean the soldiers ignored warnings, refused to hear the truth, or rejected what stood directly before them. Only weeks later, Custer would advance after ignoring almost every warning from his scouts. The vision was not a military order. Sitting Bull did not use it to organize companies, divide battle lines, or choose the ground for combat. But among those who trusted his spiritual power, it created a sense that the coming confrontation had been foretold. Before Custer saw the village, many people inside it believed they had already seen his fate. If Sitting Bull was the spiritual center, Crazy Horse was one of the most respected warriors. He was an Oglala Lakota man, about 35 years old during the summer of 1876. He had taken part in many conflicts since his youth. His reputation came not from loud speeches or colorful clothing, but from entering the most dangerous places during battle. Crazy Horse wore no uniform and did not use the large feathered headdress later artwork often gave native leaders. In battle accounts described a lightning symbol painted on his face and hailstone marks on his body. He also placed a small stone behind his ear. These signs were part of spiritual preparation, not a performance for others. He was known for reading terrain and moving warriors through areas hidden from American cavalry. Ravines, gullies, and folds in the grasslands could conceal dozens of advancing men. At Little Bighorn, that terrain helped warriors appear along Custer's flanks and behind his force. But Crazy Horse did not command a unified army modeled on the United States military. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors fought through kinship groups, warrior societies, or leaders they trusted. A leader could persuade others to follow, but could not simply order the entire village. This made the camp's response difficult for officers accustomed to formation warfare to predict. There was no single headquarters the army could destroy to paralyze the whole force. Once the attack began, hundreds of small groups could organize, mount their horses, and ride toward the gunfire. Gall, an influential Hunkpapa Lakota leader, was also inside the camp. He was an experienced warrior, known for his physical strength and ability to rally people during chaos. Reno's attack would turn the battle for Gall from community defense into something deeply personal. 2 Moons and Lame White Man were important Northern Cheyenne leaders. Crow King Lodog He-Dog and many others later provided accounts of the battle. No individual controlled the entire fight, but together they formed the power Custer had severely underestimated. The camp was so large that one end might not immediately know what was happening at the other. When Reno's guns opened fire in the south on June 25th, many people in the north did not clearly hear or understand the attack. News traveled through shouted warnings, mounted riders and families fleeing from the teepees. Women immediately gathered children, essential belongings, and horses before leading them toward safer ground. Elders received help crossing the river or moving away from the direction of the gunfire. Meanwhile, warriors found weapons, caught horses, and rode toward the sound of battle. This was not the reaction of a force already waiting in formation. It was the response of a community realizing that its families were under attack. The speed with which ordinary life became armed resistance completely surprised Reno. The United States Army relied on a simple assumption when attacking native villages. If soldiers appeared suddenly, women and children would flee. Horses would be captured, and warriors could not organize. That tactic had worked for Custer at Washita on November 27, 1868. But Little Bighorn was not Washita. This camp was far larger, contained many more warriors, and occupied terrain that concealed the defenders' movements. Custer was preparing to use an old tactic against an entirely different target. He also misunderstood why the people had gathered. They were not broken groups attempting to hide from the army. They were families that had chosen to remain close because they understood the army would continue coming. Custer believed the village's size made it easy to locate. He failed to understand that the same size made it nearly impossible to defeat with one rapid attack. Not everyone inside the camp wanted war. Many hoped only to hunt through the summer and continue their lives, while some had relatives living on reservations. The government's division between friendly and hostile people did not reflect their actual relationships. A person might receive government rations during winter and leave to hunt when the weather became warmer. One family might have relatives on a reservation, others with Sitting Bull, and another serving the army as a scout. Life on the Great Plains was not divided into the clear sides described in military reports. The Crow and Arikara scouts traveling with Custer also revealed that complexity. They were native people with histories of territorial conflict with the Lakota. They cooperated with the United States Army because they believed it served the interests of their own communities. They did not view the coming battle from the same perspective as the people living inside the camp. Those scouts understood the scale of what lay ahead. They read horse tracks the width of the trail and the number of teepee poles dragged across the ground. Details an officer might dismiss told them that thousands of people had recently crossed the land. By June 24, 1876, the camp had moved from the Rosebud region into the Little Bighorn Valley. The teepee circles were rebuilt beside the river. Horses were released onto the grasslands, and daily life resumed. Most people in the camp did not know that Custer was less than 2 days' march away. That evening, fires burned along the valley. Children slept inside the teepees. Warriors cared for horses, and families prepared for another summer day. Across the distant ridges, the 7th Cavalry continued moving closer. On the morning of June 25th, smoke from thousands of fires rose above the camp. From a high point to the east, Crow and Arikara scouts looked into the valley and recognized the village's enormous size. What they saw showed that Custer was approaching something far beyond every previous estimate. Custer would not see the entire camp from his position. Ridges, distance, and smoke concealed many of the teepees below. But he did not need to see everything because the men who understood the land had already warned him. The village was too large. There were too many warriors. The 7th Cavalry should not advance alone. Custer continued anyway. He believed that waiting would allow the camp to disperse and destroy his chance for victory. He did not understand that the people below were no longer small groups trying to avoid the army. They were a community, driven together by the same military pressure now approaching them. Within hours, Custer would divide the regiment and attack from several directions. He believed speed, surprise, and fear would destroy the village before its warriors could gather. But beside the Little Bighorn River, thousands of people had a reason to stand their ground. They did not see themselves as enemies rebelling against the government. They saw women, children, horses, teepees, and the remains of a way of life under siege. When the first gunshot sounded, they would not fight to capture a hill. They would fight for everything behind them. 8 days before Custer, another army column had been stopped on June 17, 1876, 8 days before Little Bighorn. General George Crook led an army column north from Wyoming Territory. His force included more than 1,000 soldiers, militia members, and Crow and Shoshone scouts. Their mission was to find Lakota and Cheyenne groups living outside the reservation and force them to surrender. Crook was one of 3 commanders participating in the summer campaign of 1876. His column advanced from the south while General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon approached from other directions. If the plan worked, the native communities would be trapped between several army forces at the same time. But the campaign depended on something the army could not control. The columns were hundreds of miles apart, moving across vast territory with almost no rapid means of communication. A defeat in the south could occur without the officers in the north knowing anything about it. On the morning of June 17, Crook stopped his force near Rosebud Creek. The soldiers had marched for days, and many believed the enemy was still far away. Then gunfire suddenly erupted from the surrounding ridges. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne warriors had deliberately gone out to meet Crook. They did not wait for the army to attack their village. They left the camp to stop the soldiers before they reached the women and children. Crazy Horse was one of the figures who played an important role in that counterattack. The battle began at about 8 a.m. and lasted nearly 6 hours. Warrior groups repeatedly emerged from ravines, attacked, and withdrew before the army could organize a pursuit. The Rosebud terrain spread thousands of fighters across many small engagements over several ridges. Crook had a large and well-equipped force, but he could not force the enemy to remain in one formation, where artillery and rifles could use their full power. Whenever the soldiers captured one ridge, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors appeared somewhere else. Several of Crook's units were repeatedly close to being separated from the main force. Crow and Shoshone scouts fought fiercely to protect the army's flanks. They understood how Lakota warriors used the terrain. Rosebud was not simply a battle between white soldiers and native people. It was a conflict involving several nations with their own long histories of rivalry. During the fighting, a Cheyenne warrior named Comes in Sight was shot from his horse. As those around him were being driven back, his sister, Buffalo Calf Road Woman, rode directly into the danger. She pulled her brother onto her horse and carried him away while bullets continued flying around them. Her action made such an impression that the Cheyenne remembered Rosebud by another name. To them, it was the battle where the girl saved her brother. 8 days later, Buffalo Calf Road Woman would appear again in oral traditions connected to Custer's death. Before a Cheyenne woman may have struck Custer down, she rode through gunfire to save a member of her family. By early afternoon, both sides had suffered losses, but neither had been destroyed. Crook still controlled his force, but the soldiers were exhausted. Many were wounded, and ammunition was becoming a concern. He decided not to continue advancing north. After the battle, Crook withdrew to the Goose Creek area to rest, treat the wounded, and wait for supplies. The strongest southern column of the campaign no longer advanced toward Little Bighorn. At the decisive moment, an important part of the military encirclement disappeared. Tactically, Rosebud was not a crushing victory. Crook did not lose his entire force, and Crazy Horse did not completely destroy the American column. But measured against the campaign's objective, the Lakota and Cheyenne achieved what they needed. They stopped Crook from reaching the camp. They protected their families for 8 more days and removed a major column from the operation closing around them. It was a victory measured not by the number of dead, but by the time they gained. Rosebud did not destroy the United States Army, but it caused Custer to enter Little Bighorn without a column that should have been advancing from the south. Terry Gibbon and Custer did not receive complete information about the result at Rosebud. There were no telegraph lines connecting the army columns across the Great Plains. Messengers had to cross hundreds of miles of dangerous terrain. As Custer approached Little Bighorn, he did not know that Crook had stopped in the south. This does not mean Crook would certainly have saved Custer if he had continued forward. The distance between the forces remained great, and no plan required them to attack the village at the same hour. But Crook's absence placed the full military pressure on the remaining columns. Rosebud also delivered a warning that Custer never received. The warriors gathering beside Little Bighorn were not small, disorganized groups ready to flee when the army appeared. They had enough people, horses, and confidence to attack a large military force directly. Crazy Horse left Rosebud with greater prestige. The warriors had seen that the army could be stopped by using terrain attacking the flanks and denying it control of the battle. 8 days later, similar tactics would be used with far greater force. Crook stopped, but Custer's march continued. On June 22, 1876, the 7th Cavalry left General Terry's position and followed the trail toward Little Bighorn Valley. Custer believed his mission was to locate the village, prevent its escape, and remain connected with the other forces. He did not know that one army column had already been stopped. He did not know that more warriors had joined the camp after Rosebud. And he did not know that the people beyond the ridges had already proved they could directly confront the United States Army. But the Crow and Arikara scouts traveling with Custer began noticing the signs. The trail grew wider, horse tracks became denser, and marks from dragged teepee poles covered the ground. Every mile forward told them that the village was larger than the command had predicted. On June 25, 1876, the scouts climbed to a high point known as Crow's Nest. From there, they saw smoke from thousands of fires and horse herds covering the valley floor. Within seconds, they understood what Custer still refused to accept. Ahead was not a group of people running away. It was the force that had stopped George Crook at Rosebud. And this time, they were far more numerous. The first people to see the disaster on the morning of June 25, 1876, Crow and Arikara scouts of the 7th Cavalry stood on a height later called Crow's Nest. The early light was still weak, but they could see cooking smoke covering the valley and horse herds beside the Little Bighorn. From those signs alone, they knew Custer was approaching a camp larger than anything his commanders had predicted. These scouts did not wear complete United States Army uniforms, but they played a vital role in the campaign. They found routes, read tracks, located water, and noticed changes in the ground that an Eastern officer might overlook. On the Great Plains, flattened grass, or marks left by dragging teepee poles, could reveal that thousands had recently passed. Custer's column included Crow scouts, such as White Man Runs Him Goes Ahead Harry Moccasin and Curly. Arikara scouts also accompanied them, including Bloody Knife, who was especially close to Major Marcus Reno. They came from communities with different histories, goals, and enemies. Not one united native group, serving for the same reason. The Crow had competed with the Lakota over hunting grounds for generations. As the Lakota expanded westward, areas once used by the Crow for buffalo hunting gradually became smaller. For some Crow, cooperation with the United States Army was a way to protect their remaining land from a growing rival. The Arikara also had a history of conflict with Lakota groups. Disease warfare and population decline caused their communities severe losses during the 19th century. Some served the army for wages, or trophies, or an opportunity to fight long-standing enemies. That did not mean they no longer belonged to the native world. They still spoke their languages, followed their customs, and understood the land in ways American soldiers did not. They simply stood on another side of a conflict, far more complex than the image of white men fighting native people. The first people to warn Custer about the village were also those history often erased from both sides of the battle. From Crow's Nest, the scouts could not count the exact number of teepees, but they saw unmistakable signs of dense smoke, enormous horse herds, and trails wide enough for an entire city. Every sign carried the same message: the village was too large. Some scouts told Custer that the warriors ahead could force the 7th Cavalry to fight for several days. Mitch Boyer, an interpreter and guide whose mother was Santee, Dakota, reportedly warned that they would never come out. The exact words changed across later accounts, but the scouts' fear cannot be denied. Custer could not see the entire camp from his position. Missed distance and folds in the terrain concealed most of the valley below. He also doubted that the smoke identified by the scouts came from a village as large as they claimed. This was not the first time an American officer doubted the knowledge of native scouts. The Army hired them for their ability to read the land, yet their judgment could be ignored when it challenged a commander. Custer needed them to find the way, but rejected the conclusion to which their evidence led. By then, Lakota hunting parties had discovered signs of the cavalry's approach. Custer understood that surprise was disappearing and feared the entire camp would scatter if he delayed. His fear of losing the target became stronger than his fear of the enemy's size. Custer had succeeded through speed before. During the Civil War, he often charged before the enemy could organize. At Washita in 1868, he had attacked a village at dawn. Those victories taught him that hesitation could be more dangerous than advancing. But Little Bighorn was not a Civil War battlefield, nor was it the small Cheyenne village at Washita. Ahead were thousands of people gathered after months of military pursuit. The Crow Scouts understood that the decision to attack had almost been made. According to some accounts, they removed army clothing and dressed in traditional battle clothes. They prepared themselves as men expecting to enter their final battle. It was not cowardice, but the choice of men who believed they might die and wanted to decide how they entered the next world. Curly, a very young Crow Scout, later became one of the most frequently mentioned figures in the story. He survived the battle and was portrayed for years as a witness to Custer's final moments. But Curly was not beside Custer when all 5 companies were destroyed. He left the area before the encirclement completely closed. Later stories exaggerated his account to fill the absence of surviving American witnesses. History needed someone to describe the last stand, so it turned a distant scout into Custer's final pair of eyes. Other Crow Scouts also left Custer's force before the last stage. They recognized that the path ahead had become hopeless. They did not want to die in a plan they had warned against from the beginning. Mitch Boyer and several other scouts remained and were killed with the 5 companies. Farther south, Bloody Knife continued with Major Reno. He understood the language, terrain, and how Lakota warriors could move through tall grass beside the river. But even his warnings could not prepare Reno for the force that would pour out of the camp. The Arikara scouts did more than guide the soldiers. When the attack began, they fought protected horses and tried to prevent Reno's formation from being surrounded. Several would die beside the American soldiers they had served throughout the campaign. Across the battlefield, the Lakota and Cheyenne viewed those scouts differently. They did not see innocent native people trapped in someone else's war. They saw men guiding soldiers toward the teepees of women and children. In battle, shared ancestry did not erase the fact that they stood on opposing sides. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths of Little Bighorn. Native communities did not form one united group with the same territory, interests, and enemies. They had wars, alliances, and disputes that existed long before the United States Army entered the Great Plains. The United States government took advantage of those divisions. The Army hired Crow, Arikara, and Shoshone scouts because they knew the land languages and tactics of native opponents. But the scouts also used the Army to pursue the survival interests of their own communities. Neither side completely controlled the other. The Army needed its scouts, but often failed to respect their advice. The scouts needed the Army, but that did not mean they supported every policy it carried out. Custer had some of the best men available to read the land, but he listened only until their conclusions threatened his plan. Around noon on June 25, the 7th Cavalry reached a divide leading toward the Little Bighorn. Custer still could not see the entire camp, but he now knew his force had been discovered. Instead of stopping and concentrating the regiment, he prepared to divide it. Major Reno would be ordered to attack the southern end of the village. Captain Frederick Benteen would lead 3 companies on a wide sweep to the left. He would scout the area and block possible escape routes. The pack train carrying reserve ammunition would remain behind because it moved too slowly. Custer kept 5 companies and continued moving north. His plan assumed Reno would attack from one direction while he appeared from another. If the camp panicked and fled, the 2 forces could trap its people between them. But the plan had a fatal weakness. It worked only if the village ran. If the warriors stood and counterattacked, Custer's separated groups would become isolated across miles of terrain. The scouts saw this before the first bullet was fired. They did not need military maps or intelligence reports to understand the balance of power. They only needed to look into the valley. The cooking smoke revealed thousands of families. The horse herds revealed thousands of people capable of moving quickly. The trails revealed a force larger than any unit Custer had brought with him. But Custer did not turn back. He did not wait for Terry attempt to reunite with Gibbon or keep the regiment together. He ordered the advance. Within hours, some of the men who warned him would lie dead beside the soldiers on the grassland. Those who survived carried the story back to their communities. But their names rarely appeared in paintings of the last stand. In America's legend, there was almost no one except Custer and the warriors who killed him. The truth was more complicated. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors fought to protect their families beside the river. Crow and Arikara scouts guided the army because of their own nation's conflicts and interests. At the center stood a commander who received the most accurate warnings and chose to ignore them. By early afternoon on June 25th, nearly every opportunity to avoid battle had disappeared. Custer divided the 7th Cavalry into units that could no longer see one another across the broken hills. One regiment entered the valley. It would never fully assemble again. The decision to divide the regiment. On June 25, 1876, Custer faced a choice that was no longer simple. The trail showed that the camp ahead was enormous, but Lakota hunting parties had discovered the approaching column. Custer believed the element of surprise was disappearing. If he waited, he feared thousands in the valley would pack their teepees and scatter before the army could close in. The campaign's original plan was to drive the Lakota and Cheyenne communities toward General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon. The columns were expected to approach the Little Bighorn region around June 26th, but the vast terrain made precise coordination nearly impossible. Custer had been given freedom to adjust his actions in the field, and he used that authority to attack earlier. This decision is often described as complete disobedience, but the truth is more complicated. Terry's orders allowed Custer to modify the plan if conditions required it. The broader objective remained finding the village and coordinating with the other forces. The mistake was not simply that Custer advanced. It was how he advanced, after learning that the enemy was far larger than expected. Custer could have kept the entire 7th Cavalry concentrated. He could have stopped, confirmed the village's position, and waited for the pack train and reserve ammunition. But doing so meant surrendering speed, the quality he believed had created his greatest victories. Before the campaign, Custer had refused to take Gatling guns. The multi-barreled weapons offered powerful firepower, but required mule teams and would slow movement across rough terrain. Custer chose speed over firepower because he still believed the greatest danger was allowing the village to escape. He also carried no famous sword like the one later shown in paintings of the battle. Most 7th Cavalry officers left their swords behind because they were impractical during a long pursuit. The image of Custer raising a sword on Last Stand Hill belongs to the legend created after his death. Around noon, Custer brought the regiment to a divide where the trails separated. Ahead were rolling ridges, deep ravines, and the Little Bighorn River winding around the camp. From this point, units moving in different directions could quickly disappear from one another's view. The terrain created the illusion that the units were not far apart. But even a low ridge could conceal hundreds of cavalrymen. Ravines also made movement in a straight line nearly impossible. Once the gunfire began, every group would have to guess what was happening to the others. Custer divided the regiment into 4 sections. He did not know that from that moment, the 7th Cavalry would never fully assemble again. Units separated to surround the village were instead divided by the terrain and the enemy. Major Marcus Reno received companies A, G, and M, totaling about 140 men. His orders were to cross the Little Bighorn, enter the southern end of the camp, and attack immediately. Custer told Reno that the entire village lay ahead and that the remaining force would support him. Captain Frederick Benteen received companies D, H, and K, about 125 men. He was ordered to make a wide sweep south and west, scout the ridges, and block anyone fleeing the camp. The order carried Benteen away from both Reno and Custer at the most critical moment. Captain Thomas McDougall and Company B remained behind to guard the pack train. The train carried food equipment and most of the regiment's reserve ammunition, but it moved much more slowly than the cavalry units. When Custer later needed more ammunition, the pack train remained far behind him. Custer kept companies C, E, F, I, and L, totaling about 210 men. The group included his brother Tom, his younger brother Boston, and his nephew Audie Reed. Several officers closest to Custer also rode with him. He led them north along the ridges, searching for a river crossing to attack the other end of the camp. The plan relied on a familiar tactic. Reno would strike the village from the south and force its people to flee north. Custer would appear in front of them and block their escape. Benteen would stop smaller groups fleeing west, while the pack train followed with ammunition. On paper, it was a coordinated attack from several directions, but it could succeed only if the village panicked and the warriors failed to organize a counterattack. There was no clear plan if Reno was stopped or Custer met a large force before the two wings could support each other. Custer divided his command to surround the village, but in that same moment he made each part of his regiment vulnerable to being surrounded. Custer had divided his forces during previous campaigns. At Washita on November 27, 1868, his units approached a Cheyenne village from several directions and attacked at dawn. But the Little Bighorn camp was many times larger and had enough warriors to confront each separated column. The distance created another major difference. The Little Bighorn camp stretched almost 3 miles. An attack on the southern end could not immediately affect the northern end. When Reno opened fire, many people farther north still did not know the army had arrived. That gave the warriors time to find weapons, catch horses, and assemble. Instead of the entire camp fleeing in panic, each section began responding at its own pace. Every minute Reno was delayed gave the defense another minute to grow stronger. In the early afternoon, Reno led his 3 companies down into the valley. His men crossed a shallow section of the Little Bighorn and advanced in line across the flat ground south of the camp. Ahead of them stood the first teepees among cottonwood trees and tall grass. Reno still could not see the entire length of the village. From the low valley floor, trees and bends in the river concealed most of the northern camp. He knew only that Custer had ordered an attack and promised support from somewhere beyond the village. At first, Reno kept his men mounted. The formation advanced several hundred yards before he realized that the number of people ahead was rapidly increasing. He ordered his soldiers to dismount and form a skirmish line. 1 man out of every 4 remained behind to hold the horses. That decision left only about 3/4 of Reno's force able to fire directly. His line spread across the valley floor, firing Springfield carbines at the approaching warriors. Behind them, the horses and handlers became a weakness if the enemy moved around either flank. The first shots were not directed only at warriors. Bullets passed through teepees at the southern end of the camp where Sitting Bull's Hunkpapa people were living. Women and children began running toward the river as warriors rushed to catch their horses. Gall, a Hunkpapa Lakota leader, lost 2 wives and 3 children during the attack. At that moment, the battle was no longer about Washington's orders, the Black Hills, or the January deadline. It became the revenge of a man who had just watched his family die. Hunkpapa warriors gathered around Gall and advanced directly toward Reno's line. Other groups began riding south while men on foot moved through tall grass and the trees beside the river. Within minutes, Reno realized that he was not attacking a village that was trying to escape. He was facing a force that continued to grow. From the ridges, Custer could not clearly see everything happening below. He may have seen movement dust and part of the camp, but the terrain concealed the collapse beginning within Reno's command. Custer's plan still depended on the belief that Reno was holding the enemy in place. Benteen was still conducting his reconnaissance to the west. He found no fleeing groups, no second camp, and no force that needed to be blocked. The wide sweep only carried his 3 companies farther from the battle that was actually beginning. The pack train remained behind, crossing the ridges with heavily loaded animals. The distance between the reserve ammunition and the men firing their weapons continued to increase. The regiment had been stretched into a long line across terrain no single group could fully observe. All 4 sections of the 7th Cavalry stood on the same battlefield. But each section was beginning to enter a different battle. Reno saw warriors appearing in front of him on both flanks and among the trees beside the river. Their numbers did not decrease after each volley. They continued to grow. His skirmish line began withdrawing toward the cottonwood grove behind it. Custer continued north in search of a river crossing. Benteen was returning from an unsuccessful reconnaissance, and the pack train slowly followed the cavalry trail. None of them knew the exact position condition or intentions of the other groups. Only hours earlier, they had been one regiment of more than 600 soldiers. By early afternoon on June 25th, they had become units divided by distance, terrain, and incomplete information. Custer's mistake was no longer merely a decision on a map. People had begun to die. The attack that turned a village into an army. At about 3 p.m. on June 25, 1876, Major Marcus Reno led 3 companies across a ford in the Little Bighorn River. Ahead was the southern end of the camp, where Hunkpapa Lakota families lived among the cottonwood trees. Reno had been ordered to attack, and believed Custer would soon appear elsewhere to support him. At first, about 140 cavalrymen advanced in line across the valley floor. As they approached the first teepees, Reno saw increasing numbers of warriors and ordered his men to dismount. 1 man out of every 4 had to hold the horses, reducing the fighting force to about 3/4 of its strength. Springfield Model 1873 carbines began firing across the grassland. Bullets passed through tall grass trees and several teepees before women and children had time to escape. Within minutes, a military attack became a fight to protect families. Gall, a Hunkpapa Lakota leader, lost 2 wives and 3 children during the opening gunfire. He had no time to grieve, because the shooting continued and soldiers were advancing toward the camp. Gall gathered warriors around him and charged directly toward Reno's line. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors from farther north began riding toward the battle. Some moved through tall grass beside the river, while others used ravines to approach the army's flanks. Reno's line quickly faced a larger force, advancing from several directions. Custer had expected the people inside the camp to panic and flee. Instead, every bullet fired into the teepees brought more warriors into the battle. The attack did not break the village apart. It awakened its full strength. Women carried children across the river or fled north away from the fighting. Elders were helped onto horses, while those able to fight moved toward the gunfire. Within a short time, an ordinary camp became a united community resisting an attack. Reno's skirmish line held its position for about 15 to 20 minutes. The soldiers continued firing, but the number of warriors ahead did not decrease. It continued to grow. When both flanks came under threat, Reno ordered a withdrawal into a cottonwood grove beside the river. At first, the retreat remained organized. The horse holders moved the animals to the rear, while other soldiers fired covering shots and withdrew in stages. But once they entered the trees, visibility fell to only a few yards, and the companies began losing contact. Inside the grove, soldiers could not tell where the warriors might appear. Gunfire echoed among the trees, horses screamed in panic, and wounded men lay scattered beneath the brush. Reno lost the ability to see or control his entire force. Bloody Knife, the Arikara scout riding beside Reno, was shot through the head. Blood and tissue struck the major's face and uniform. Witnesses later believed that this moment caused Reno to lose control of himself completely. He ordered the soldiers to mount and withdraw from the grove. The command was not clearly communicated to every company. Some men continued fighting, while others were already racing toward the river. An organized withdrawal immediately became a rout. The soldiers galloped across open ground between the trees and the Little Bighorn River. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors pursued closely, shooting men separated from the formation and bringing down slower horses. Wounded or unhorsed soldiers had almost no chance of survival. At the river crossing, the water reached as high as the horses' chests in some places. Men and animals crowded together while some soldiers fell into the water or were swept from their saddles. Warriors along the riverbank fired into the mass of men struggling to reach the eastern side. There were no longer companies' battle lines or clear orders. There were only men trying to force their horses across the river before the pursuing warriors caught them. In less than 1 hour, Reno's charge had become a desperate flight for survival. About 40 of Reno's soldiers, officers, and scouts died in the Valley of the Grove in the river crossing. The survivors climbed the eastern bluffs and stopped on open ground, exhausted and disorganized. They did not know where Custer was or whether his 5 companies were fighting. Reno gathered the survivors on the hill, but his authority had been badly damaged. The soldiers saw Bloody Knife's blood covering his face and heard his inconsistent orders. They also knew that many of their comrades had been abandoned below. Some officers began organizing the defense without waiting for Reno's instructions. Meanwhile, Benteen was returning from his reconnaissance to the west. He heard gunfire from the direction of the village and increased his pace, but he did not yet know which part of the regiment was in danger. When he reached the bluffs, he did not see an attack unfolding according to plan. He saw Reno's men fleeing from the valley in disorder. Custer had divided the regiment to attack the village from several directions, but his first column had been driven back before the 5 northern companies found a river crossing. The plan was already collapsing. The man who created it still did not know. The final message. As Reno's force collapsed in the south, Custer led 5 companies north along the ridges east of the Little Bighorn River. From the high ground he could see sections of the camp stretching along the water, but bends in the river trees and folds in the terrain prevented him from seeing the enemy's full size. Custer was searching for a ford where his cavalry could cross and attack the northern end of the camp. If Reno maintained pressure from the south, the 2 wings could trap the village between them. But Reno had already withdrawn from the valley, and the first part of the plan no longer existed. Warriors from the south began leaving the pursuit of Reno and turning toward Custer. Those near the northern end of the camp also mounted their horses and moved into the ravines leading toward the ridges. The force Custer believed was divided was actually gathering around him. At some point during the afternoon of June 25th, Custer realized the situation was more serious than expected. He sent bugler Giovanni Martini, an Italian immigrant known in the army as John Martin, back to find Benteen. Martini carried the final written message to leave Custer's 5 companies. The note was hurriedly written in pencil by Lieutenant William Cook Custer's adjutant. It ordered Benteen to advance quickly because a large village lay ahead, and told him to bring the pack train. Repeating the order to bring the pack train showed that Custer needed the reserve ammunition behind him. Martini turned his horse and rode away from the formation. He did not know he had become the last confirmed person to see Custer's command alive. After he disappeared beyond the ridge, no one from the 5 companies returned to explain what happened next. The message contained only a few lines, but it showed that the plan had changed. Custer no longer believed the village was simply fleeing before him. He was now urgently requesting reinforcements and reserve ammunition. The commander who had chosen speed over firepower was now waiting for firepower from the rear. Martini met Benteen on his return route. Benteen had completed his unsuccessful reconnaissance and was leading 3 companies toward the sound of gunfire. After reading the message, he continued forward, but soon encountered Reno's survivors. On the bluffs, Benteen saw wounded soldiers, exhausted horses, and units that had nearly lost all formation. Reno said his force had been overwhelmed in the valley and needed immediate support. Benteen had to choose between saving a collapsing force or continuing toward Custer. He decided to stop. That decision became one of the greatest controversies of the Battle of Little Bighorn. Critics argued that Benteen disobeyed an urgent order and abandoned Custer. His defenders argued that his 3 companies might have been destroyed before reaching the northern command. Benteen did not remain completely inactive. He helped organize the defense, distribute ammunition, and prevent Reno's men from continuing to flee. When the pack train arrived, the hilltop force gained ammunition, equipment, and soldiers needed to hold the position. Captain Thomas Weir of Company D still wanted to move north. He led his company away from Reno's position to a height later known as Weir Point. Other companies followed one by one, although no unified order had been issued for the advance. From Weir Point, they could see columns of dust and gun smoke in the area where Custer was fighting. Some saw groups moving across the ridges, but distance made soldiers and warriors difficult to distinguish. They did not know whether the 5 companies still held formation or had already begun to collapse. Native warriors quickly advanced toward Weir Point. Reno and Benteen's men realized they might be cut off from the defensive position and pack train behind them. The companies withdrew to the hill, where they would remain surrounded through June 25 and June 26. Benteen never reached Custer, but he played a major role in protecting Reno's force, organizing the defenses and maintaining resistance for nearly 2 days. About 350 men on Reno Hill survived until the warriors left the area. That does not answer whether Benteen could have saved Custer. When he received the message, the northern companies may still have had time to receive support, but the encirclement may also have been nearly complete. There was no shared clock, no direct communication, and no survivor beside Custer who could establish the exact timeline. The 1879 military inquiry did not convict Benteen, yet his long-standing hostility toward Custer caused every decision he made to remain under suspicion. The shadow of Washita in 1868 remained behind the controversy. Benteen believed Custer had abandoned Major Joel Elliott there. There was a bitter paradox in the decision at Little Bighorn. Benteen had hated Custer for supposedly abandoning his men. 8 years later, Benteen himself was accused of abandoning Custer. History placed both men inside the same question and changed only the name of the man who was not rescued. As Reno and Benteen strengthened their defenses, gunfire continued in the north. Then it gradually weakened and disappeared. The men on the hill did not know whether the silence meant Custer had won, withdrawn, or been destroyed. They would not know the answer for 2 days. In the north, Custer's 5 companies had passed beyond the sight of every surviving American force. The final message had been sent, but the assistance it requested would never arrive. From this point forward, the story would no longer be told through Army reports. It would be told by the positions of the dead cartridge cases in the grass and the warriors who surrounded them. There was no last stand, only a battle line breaking apart. On the afternoon of June 25, 1876, Custer led about 210 men north along the ridges east of the Little Bighorn River. He was still searching for a river crossing to attack the camp from the direction opposite Reno. But by the time the 5 companies neared the water, the battle Custer had planned no longer existed. Reno was no longer applying pressure at the southern end of the camp. Benteen remained far away and the pack train carrying ammunition had not caught up. Custer now stood alone with 5 companies before a force growing larger by the minute. Some Lakota and Cheyenne accounts place Custer's men near a crossing later called Medicine Tail Coulee. He may have sent part of his force down to examine the route toward the village, but there is no firm evidence that all 5 companies attempted to cross the river there. What is certain is that Custer could not enter the camp and had to return to the ridges. Meanwhile, warriors who had driven Reno back began moving north. They crossed the river, advanced through ravines, and used folds in the terrain to conceal their approach. Custer could see dust and scattered groups, but not how many warriors were closing around him. The land east of the Little Bighorn was not one isolated hill. It was a chain of ridges, deep ravines, and small slopes where a force could disappear and reappear much closer. Across that ground, Custer's 5 companies were stretched into a long formation that was difficult to support. Company L, under Lieutenant James Calhoun, held a position on the southern ridge later called Calhoun Hill. Nearby, Tom Custer's Company C and other units attempted to protect the right flank of the formation. This may have been one of the last places where the 5 companies still maintained clear order. The soldiers dismounted and formed a firing line. Cartridge cases found later suggest that they stood fairly close together and fired toward advancing warriors. For a brief period, the defensive line held. But the warriors did not attack from only one direction. Some advanced from the valley, while others moved through ravines to appear on the flanks and rear. Whenever the soldiers turned their weapons toward one threat, another opening appeared. Many accounts place Crazy Horse in a major movement around the northern side or rear of Custer's command. His exact movements cannot be reconstructed with certainty, but the accounts show that Lakota and Cheyenne warriors used speed and terrain to break the cavalry formation. They did not need to attack as one unified army to create pressure from every direction. The balance of firepower was also more complicated than Custer had expected. The soldiers carried single-shot Springfield Model 1873 carbines. Each round had to be fired, extracted, and replaced before the weapon could fire again. When the rifles heated or brass cases expanded, reloading could slow precisely as warriors closed the distance. Many warriors carried bows, older firearms, or weapons designed for close combat. But some possessed Henry and Winchester repeating rifles that could fire several rounds before reloading. At crucial points, native firepower was not as weak as the United States Army commonly assumed. Later battlefield surveys found Springfield cartridge cases marked by knife blades along their rims. The marks showed that some soldiers used knives to pry jammed cases from their rifle chambers. On a line under attack, losing only a few seconds could determine whether a man lived or died. At Calhoun Hill, the earliest cartridge cases appeared in relatively tight clusters. Then the evidence suddenly scattered in several directions, suggesting that the defensive position had failed. The line did not retreat one orderly step at a time. It appears to have collapsed rapidly. When a cavalry line broke, the horse holders could no longer control the animals. Terrified horses tore free, ran through the formation, or disappeared over the ridges. The soldiers lost their means of escape at the exact moment they needed to withdraw from a larger force. Cohesion between the companies was Custer's final protection. A lone soldier could not resist several mounted warriors who understood the terrain. As the distance between groups widened, 5 companies became small clusters fighting only to survive. This is where the legend of the last stand begins to collapse. There is no evidence that all 210 men formed one complete circle around Custer and fought to the final bullet. The ground reveals several separate defensive positions, followed by dispersal and flight. Survivors from Calhoun Hill withdrew toward higher ridges to the north. Some tried to gather near the place later called Last Stand Hill. Others fled into ravines or searched for a route toward the river. They no longer acted as 5 companies under one unified command. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors closed in more quickly. As the distance narrowed, single-shot rifles lost their advantage. The fighting shifted to bows, spears, axes, and war clubs. Soldiers who ran out of ammunition, suffered jammed weapons, or lost their horses were forced into close combat. The struggle no longer resembled a battle between 2 organized formations. Groups of soldiers were pursued along ridges through ravines and across open grass. An organized battle had become a hunt for men with no route of escape. Captain Miles Keogh died on the slope between Calhoun Hill and Last Stand Hill. His body was found with many men from Company I. The group may have tried to hold its position or withdraw north before being overwhelmed. Nearby, Keogh's horse, Comanche, remained alive despite suffering several wounds. No one knows how long Custer survived during the collapse. He may have died early when the first defensive lines were broken. Or he may have lived long enough to see the final companies gather on the hill. The 2 bullet wounds in his body cannot reveal the order of those final minutes. Tom Custer, Boston Custer, and their 18-year-old nephew, Audie Reed, all died in the same area. A march that began with 3 brothers and a nephew ended on ridges thousands of miles from home. No member of their family survived to describe the final words they may have exchanged. On Last Stand Hill, some soldiers gathered near Custer and the other officers. But the bodies later found there did not form the even defensive circle shown in paintings. They lay in small groups, separated by open spaces and isolated dead men. Some may have fought until their ammunition was gone. Others may have attempted to escape when they saw the final position collapse. During those minutes, courage and panic could exist within the same person. Custer's battle may have lasted from about 30 minutes to nearly 1 hour, depending on when its beginning is measured. But the final stage appears to have unfolded very quickly. Once the southern positions failed, no force remained strong enough to stop the warriors from advancing. The 5 companies were not destroyed in one instant. They collapsed through a series of breaking lines. Custer entered the battle hoping the camp would fall apart under pressure from several directions. Instead, his own force was divided, surrounded, and destroyed in the same way he had intended for the enemy. The trap did not close around the village. It closed around Custer. By late afternoon on June 25, the gunfire on Last Stand Hill became less frequent. The final warriors moved among bodies, dead horses, and abandoned weapons. Not one man from the 5 companies survived to describe the last minutes. But Last Stand Hill may not have been where Custer's final soldier died. Below the hill was a deep ravine descending toward the Little Bighorn River. There, one group made a final attempt to escape the encirclement. Deep Ravine, the ending the paintings never showed. Deep Ravine lies southeast of Last Stand Hill and descends toward the river. Its steep sides make it difficult for anyone at the bottom to see what is happening above. To a fleeing soldier, it may have looked like the only route out of the battlefield. When burial parties arrived on June 27, 1876, they found about 28 bodies in or near the ravine. The bodies lay relatively close together, unlike the dead scattered across the ridges above. Their position suggests they were not killed while holding a fixed defensive line. The group most likely ran into the ravine, hoping to reach the Little Bighorn River. If they crossed the water, they might find a route toward Reno and Benteen's position to the south. But between them and safety were open ground, the river, and hundreds of warriors controlling the area. From the bottom of the ravine, the soldiers could not clearly see the rim above. Warriors could stand on the slopes and fire downward, while those below had almost no protection. The earthen walls transformed an escape route into a trap. It is unclear whether the 28 men belonged to one company or were survivors from several units who met while fleeing. It is also impossible to know whether they left Last Stand Hill before or after Custer died. But their direction shows that part of the force tried to escape instead of continuing a last stand on the hill. That detail does not make the soldiers cowards. When a formation has collapsed, searching for an escape route is a natural human reaction. They were no longer fighting for a military plan. They were only trying to stay alive long enough to reach the river. The men in Deep Ravine may have heard the water ahead. They may have known Reno and Benteen were somewhere to the south, even without knowing the exact distance. The river became their final sign of hope. But they never reached it. Warriors appeared along both sides of the ravine. From higher ground, they could fire downward or block the exits while the soldiers were trapped below. The narrow space made it nearly impossible for horses to turn, while men on foot could not quickly climb the walls. The fighting in Deep Ravine may have lasted only a few minutes. When ammunition ran low or weapons jammed, the survivors could no longer keep the warriors at a distance. The bodies left behind suggest that no one in the group escaped the ravine. Some researchers believe this may have been where the last members of Custer's command were killed. The theory cannot be fully proven because no American witness survived, and Native accounts differ on the exact sequence. Even so, Deep Ravine strongly challenges the image that everyone died around Custer on one hill. For decades, artists focused on Last Stand Hill because Custer's body was found there. A commander, surrounded by his soldiers, created a clear story that was easy to understand and turn into a symbol. Men dying at the bottom of a ravine while running toward the river offered none of the same glory. As a result, Deep Ravine nearly disappeared from public memory. It appeared in few paintings, monuments, or 19th century stories intended for public audiences. A chaotic ending was replaced by a heroic pose. But the battlefield does not care about mythology. Body locations, cartridge cases, and the terrain remained where they had always been, even when paintings told another story. Deep Ravine preserved the part of the truth America did not want to see. Not every soldier died beside Custer. Not every man stood firmly inside a circle. Some of them ran. They ran because the line behind them had disappeared. They ran because their horses were dead, their ammunition was low, and warriors appeared on every ridge. They ran toward the water because it was the only direction that still offered hope. In military history, a retreat is often judged by whether it remains organized. But the men in Deep Ravine no longer had a unit to retreat with. No officer could rebuild the formation, and no friendly force waited ahead. Only instinct remained, driving them away from the place where everyone was dying. On the hilltop, mythology placed Custer at the center of the story. At the bottom of the ravine, history left anonymous soldiers without final words, witnesses, or famous paintings. They had only the places where their bodies were found. On June 27, burial parties lacked the time, tools, and coffins needed to remove every body. Many men were covered with soil where they fell, sometimes in graves only a few inches deep. Those in Deep Ravine were buried inside the same cut in the earth where their escape had ended. Rain, wind, and animals later exposed many of the remains. For years, bones, pieces of uniform, and equipment could still be seen on the surface. The battlefield continued telling its story because the soil was not deep enough to hide the dead. Deep Ravine forces us to see Little Bighorn differently. It was not the story of one commander standing inside a final circle. It was the story of separated groups dying in different places. Every ridge, ravine, and patch of grass preserved one part of the collapse. If the men in the ravine were the last survivors, Custer's final gunshot was not fired on Last Stand Hill. It sounded inside a cut in the earth where soldiers could not see the river they were trying to reach. There were no spectators, messengers, or heroic poses preserved for history. There were only men trapped at the bottom of a ravine. By late afternoon, all 5 of Custer's companies had been destroyed. 210 men lay from Calhoun Hill and Last Stand Hill to Deep Ravine. Gunsmoke slowly faded across the grasslands. The battle had ended, but the actions that made Little Bighorn one of America's darkest memories had not yet begun. When the gunfire finally stopped, women, elders, and families from the camp began walking onto the ridges. They saw the men who had fired into their teepees lying dead, among rifles, ammunition, uniforms, and abandoned horses. What happened next would make the burial party believe it had entered a place even more terrifying than the battlefield. What happened after the gunfire stopped? By late afternoon on June 25, 1876, the gunfire across the ridges east of the Little Bighorn River gradually faded. Gunsmoke drifted over the grass, leaving bodies, dead horses, and weapons scattered from Calhoun Hill to Deep Ravine. People from the camp began moving onto the battlefield to find relatives, recover property, and see the result of the fighting. Women, elders, and children walked among the dead soldiers. Some searched for husbands, brothers, or sons who had fought, while others recognized the men who had fired into their teepees. The anger on the battlefield was therefore not an abstract emotion. Uniforms, boots, rifles, ammunition, and belts were quickly taken from the soldiers. On the Great Plains, property taken from a defeated enemy was considered valuable war booty. Many families lacked clothing, metal, and weapons. Stripping the dead, therefore, carried the meaning of war, while also serving immediate needs for survival. But what happened did not end with the taking of trophies. Many bodies were scalped, had hands or fingers removed, or suffered damage to the eyes and face. When the burial party arrived 2 days later, it faced a scene far beyond what was normally seen after battle. To the soldiers who found their comrades, it was a brutal violation of the dead. Eastern newspapers later used those descriptions to portray the Lakota and Cheyenne as savages. But that explanation removed everything that had happened before the bodies were left on the hills. Reno's attack had fired into an area occupied by women and children. Gall lost 2 wives and 3 children, while many other families suffered deaths or injuries in the first volleys. To them, the soldiers on the grass were not anonymous strangers. They were the force that had just attacked their families. Some actions against the bodies also carried spiritual meaning. In beliefs preserved from some Lakota and Cheyenne communities, injuries after death could affect the body in the next world. Preventing an enemy from holding a weapon, seeing, or walking could stop him from causing harm after death. This should not be treated as one belief system followed identically by everyone. Actions on the battlefield could arise from revenge grief trophy ceremony or personal emotion at the same moment. One person might take clothing, another take a scalp, and another inflict damage for entirely different reasons. None of this made the scene less horrifying. It only showed that the violence was not meaningless or committed by a crowd acting without any reason. Behind it stood years of warfare, broken treaties, and families attacked inside their own camp. Tom Custer was so badly damaged that his face was nearly impossible to recognize. The two-time Medal of Honor recipient was identified by a tattoo of the Goddess of Liberty and letters on his arm. His military fame meant nothing, as his body lay among hundreds of other dead men. On June 27, 1876, relief forces under General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon reached the battlefield. The first men saw naked bodies lying beneath the sun, many already decomposing after nearly 2 days. The smell, heat, and condition of the dead made burial work almost unbearable. The burial parties lacked enough coffins and shovels. They dug shallow graves where each man had fallen, covered the bodies with thin soil, and placed wooden stakes as markers. The work continued through June 27 and 28, but it could not protect the dead from wind, rain, and animals. Within only a few months, many graves began to erode. Human bones, pieces of uniform and military equipment remained exposed on the ground for years. Little Bighorn did not immediately become a solemn memorial. It remained a neglected battlefield filled with people who had never been properly buried. But among the mutilated bodies, one drew particular attention from the burial parties. The man near the crest of Last Stand Hill had been stripped, but not scalped. His body was also far less damaged than many of those around him. It was George Armstrong Custer. Who killed Custer? Custer was found near the crest of Last Stand Hill, among the officers and soldiers of his 5 companies. His body had 2 recorded bullet wounds, one near the left temple and another on the left side of his chest. Either wound could have been fatal. No one knows which bullet struck first. No one knows whether Custer died when the Calhoun Hill line collapsed, during the retreat, or in the final minutes. No one standing beside him survived to answer. The fact that Custer was not scalped produced many theories. Some believed the warriors recognized him and left his body untouched as a sign of respect. But on a chaotic battlefield, few Lakota or Cheyenne warriors were likely to know exactly what Custer looked like. Custer had once been famous for his long blonde hair, but he cut it short before the 1876 campaign. He also wore no uniform that made him easily recognizable among the other officers. To many warriors, he may have looked like only one dead soldier among hundreds. Another theory suggests the battle ended too quickly for Custer's body to receive much attention. Those entering the battlefield may have focused on soldiers near dead relatives or men who had caused casualties inside the camp. There is no evidence that every body was treated in the same way. Some oral traditions say a Cheyenne woman intervened and claimed authority over Custer's spirit. In these accounts, his body was left with wounds meant as a warning or judgment, instead of being mutilated. However, the versions differ and cannot be fully verified. For more than a century, no certain answer existed to the question of who killed Custer. The press and biographers connected several warriors to the final shot, including Rain in the Face and White Bull. Most claims relied on oral tradition, later interpretations, or the desire to find someone famous enough to face the Custer legend. In 2005, a widely publicized Northern Cheyenne oral tradition introduced another name. According to that account, Buffalo Calf Road Woman struck Custer with a war club. She was not a famous leader in American history books, but the Cheyenne remembered her long before Little Bighorn. On June 17, 1876, Buffalo Calf Road Woman rode into the Battle of the Rosebud to rescue her brother comes in sight. He had been shot from his horse. Her act was so important that the Cheyenne remembered Rosebud as the battle where the girl saved her brother. 8 days later, she was also present at Little Bighorn. According to traditions preserved within Northern Cheyenne families, she approached Custer during the battle's final stage. She then struck him from his horse with a war club. The story does not necessarily claim that her blow alone caused his death, because Custer still had 2 bullet wounds. It only says she brought him down or struck him on the battlefield. No physical evidence can identify the person who shot or struck Custer. The bullets removed from his body cannot be matched to a specific weapon. The exact locations where he received each wound were not recorded on the day of the battle. By modern forensic standards, the case cannot be solved with certainty. But oral history does not exist solely to meet the standards of United States military records. For the Northern Cheyenne Buffalo Calf Road Woman story is part of a community memory passed through generations. It places a Native woman at the center of an event American popular culture once reserved for famous men. The story also changes the familiar image of Custer. The man usually shown standing proudly with a sword may have been knocked down as the formation around him collapsed, and the person who struck him may have been a woman fighting to protect her family and community. That does not mean Buffalo Calf Road Woman certainly killed Custer. Nor does it mean another warrior could not have fired the fatal bullets before or after the blow. The most honest conclusion is that the final answer died with those present on Last Stand Hill. The mystery exists because not one man from Custer's 5 companies survived. The surviving witnesses were Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, but their accounts were recorded at different times. Many also passed through interpreters. Memory language and the interviewer's questions all influenced what remained. For decades, American historians treated Army reports as the most reliable sources, and Native oral accounts as secondary stories. But at Little Bighorn, the Army record ended when Giovanni Martini carried Custer's final message away. Everything that followed can be understood only by listening to the survivors and studying the evidence beneath the ground. No one can say with certainty who killed George Armstrong Custer. But the absence of an answer reveals something important about how the battle was remembered. For more than a century, Americans cared more about Custer's killer than the people whose homeland the Army had entered. Custer remained the center of the story, even in defeat. The warriors defending the camp were reduced to a nameless crowd surrounding him. Women and children nearly disappeared from the paintings. Buffalo Calf Road Woman's story challenges that image by returning history to those defending their families. Custer died on June 25, 1876, but the image of his death continued changing for nearly 150 years. Each generation created a version that reflected what it wanted to believe about the West, the Army, and Native people. Only the battlefield remained silent. And because the dead could not tell the story, the final answers had to be found beneath the grass. Cartridge cases, bullets, horse bones, and abandoned objects would gradually replace legend with another picture. More than a century later, a major fire would finally help the ground begin to speak. The fire that made the battlefield speak. In August 1983, more than a century after the battle, a major wildfire swept across the Little Bighorn area. The flames burned away much of the grass and brush that had covered the battlefield for decades. When the smoke cleared, the ground revealed evidence long hidden beneath thick vegetation. For the historic site, the fire was a disaster. But for archaeologists, it created a rare opportunity to survey the battlefield on an unprecedented scale. Small objects made of brass, iron, and lead could now be found close to where they had fallen on June 25, 1876. Beginning in 1984, archaeological teams started conducting systematic searches across the ridges. They used metal detectors, detailed maps, and methods that recorded the exact location of every artifact. Instead of collecting objects as souvenirs, they treated every cartridge case and bullet as part of the story. Researchers found soldiers' Springfield cases along with ammunition from Henry and Winchester rifles. They also recovered arrowhead, buttons, and fragments of military equipment. Personal belongings, horseshoes, and bones from animals killed in the battle were also discovered. Each object was mapped to determine who had stood where and in which direction they had moved. One of the most important methods involved comparing marks left on cartridge cases by firing pins and gun mechanisms. 2 cases with matching marks were likely fired from the same weapon. If those cases appeared in different places, the person carrying that weapon may have moved between them. This method allowed archaeologists to see more than the places where weapons had been fired. They could also trace the movements of certain warriors across the battlefield. Those paths showed Native forces closing in flanking positions and moving through lines once shown as motionless in paintings. The evidence at Calhoun Hill was especially important. Soldiers' cartridge cases first appeared in a concentrated line suggesting an organized defensive position. A short distance away, however, the cases began to scatter, marking the moment when the formation broke apart. Artifacts on Last Stand Hill also failed to form one complete defensive circle. They appeared in small clusters, connected to retreat routes and isolated death sites. The evidence supported a collapse in several stages rather than one final stand around Custer. Archaeology also showed that Lakota and Cheyenne warriors carried many different types of weapons. Some used bows, older firearms, or close combat weapons, while others carried modern, repeating rifles. The battle was not between a well-armed army and warriors equipped only with bows, as older images often suggested. Springfield cartridge cases marked by knife blades added another frightening detail. At least some soldiers had to pry jammed cases from their weapons, while warriors were advancing toward them. A task taking only seconds on a training field could become a death sentence inside a collapsing formation. No single artifact can explain the entire battle. A cartridge case cannot reveal whether the shooter was frightened, wounded, or trying to save a comrade. But when thousands of objects are placed on a map, they create a picture that mythology cannot easily dismiss. For more than a century, people believed Custer's 5 companies stood still and fought to the last man. The ground revealed that they moved, gathered, broke apart, and fled in several directions. The dead left no testimony, but the objects they dropped preserved their final movements. The 1983 fire did not answer the question of who killed Custer, nor could it reconstruct every minute between Calhoun Hill and Deep Ravine. But it destroyed the foundation of an image that had dominated American memory for more than a century. The legend described a motionless circle. Archaeology revealed a force collapsing, and for the first time the battlefield was allowed to tell its own story. America needed a martyr. News of Little Bighorn reached the eastern United States in early July 1876. On July 4, America was celebrating its centennial with festivals, speeches, and praise for the nation's progress. Amid that celebration, telegraph reports announced that Custer and all 5 companies had been destroyed. The shock came from more than the number of dead. For years, Americans had been told that the peoples of the Great Plains were being subdued and Western warfare was ending. Little Bighorn proved the opposite, just as the nation was celebrating its own strength. Such a defeat required a quick explanation. If Custer died because he underestimated the enemy, divided his force, and attacked before support arrived, the army faced blame. If the Lakota and Cheyenne were defending land after a treaty was broken, the entire Black Hills policy had to be questioned. So America chose a simpler story. Custer became a hero surrounded by overwhelming forces, while the victors were portrayed as a savage mob. A military defeat was transformed into a noble sacrifice. Artists painted Custer standing on Last Stand Hill with his sword raised. His long blonde hair flowed behind him as soldiers formed a circle and fought to the final bullet. Almost every important detail in that image was inconsistent with what is known about the battle. Custer carried no sword on June 25, 1876. His hair had been cut short before the campaign, and the soldiers' bodies did not form a complete circle around him. But propaganda did not need to be accurate. It only needed to be memorable. The paintings transformed chaos into order. They erased the broken lines, the men fleeing into Deep Ravine, and companies dying far apart. Everyone was pulled toward Custer, so one commander could represent the entire story. Elizabeth Libby Custer, his wife, played a major role in protecting that image. For decades after 1876, she wrote books, gave speeches, and described him as a brave officer defeated by fate and numbers. She lived until 1933, nearly 6 decades longer than Custer. That gave her time to shape how several generations viewed him. Libby was not the only person who created the legend. Dime novels, Wild West shows, newspapers, and later movies repeated the same image. With every retelling, Custer became braver, while the reasons that brought him to Little Bighorn became less visible. In those versions, the Black Hills rarely appeared as land seized after a treaty was broken. The attack on the southern camp and the deaths of women and children were also ignored. Audiences were taken directly to Last Stand Hill, where a white man could die as the hero of his own story. Marcus Reno became a convenient target for blame. His retreat from the valley caused many to call him a coward, even though it also allowed part of the force to survive. A military inquiry in 1879 cleared him of wrongdoing, but Reno's reputation never recovered. Benteen was also suspected because he did not ride directly to Custer after receiving the final message. Yet the force he supported held out through June 26 and saved hundreds of lives. The Custer legend needed men accused of failing to rescue him. It could not easily admit that his own plan had placed everyone in danger. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were nearly nameless in public memory. Crazy Horse Sitting Bull and a few leaders were mentioned, but most warriors became a crowd surrounding the hero. Women such as Buffalo Calf Road Woman and Moving Robe Woman almost completely disappeared. Even the battlefield itself carried Custer's name. In 1946, the site was officially named Custer Battlefield National Monument. The entire landscape became a memorial to the defeated commander. White markers showed where American soldiers fell, while native deaths had almost no equivalent recognition. For more than a century, visitors entered the battlefield through the story of the losing side. They saw the cemetery monuments and Custer's name before learning about the families who had lived beside the river. The people who won the battle were erased from the place where they had won it. By the late 20th century, that form of remembrance could no longer continue without opposition. Native communities, historians, and many veterans demanded recognition for those who fought to defend the camp. They did not ask for American soldiers to be erased. They asked history to stop pretending that only one side had existed. In 1991, Congress renamed the site Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. Changing only a few words carried enormous meaning. The battlefield no longer belonged exclusively to Custer in its official name. The same law authorized the construction of a memorial honoring Native people. On June 25, 2003, exactly 127 years after the battle, the Indian Memorial was dedicated. It honored Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who defended their families' lands and way of life. After more than a century, the victors finally had a place where their voices could appear on the battlefield. One part of the memorial is called the Spirit Gate. Through it, visitors can see Last Stand Hill and the white markers of the Seventh Cavalry. The view does not erase the American dead. It places two memories face to face on the same land. That was something the old legend could not do. It needed one side to be completely heroic and the other completely savage. That simplicity prevented people from examining why the war had begun. But Little Bighorn was never simply a story of courage against overwhelming numbers. It was the story of a broken treaty. An attack carried out in the name of order, and a defeat turned into legend so the nation would not have to admit it was wrong. Custer died on the afternoon of June 25, 1876. But the image created after his death outlived the accounts of those who had defeated him. It took more than a century for the battlefield to begin restoring the names of those pushed out of the story. But changes in memory could not reverse what followed the battle. Victory at Little Bighorn did not stop the army from advancing into Lakota and Cheyenne lands. Instead, it made the United States government more determined to crush resistance with a much larger force. The victory lasted only one summer. The victory at Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876, was the most shocking defeat the United States Army suffered on the Great Plains. About 210 men with Custer were destroyed, while Reno and Benteen's forces held out for nearly 2 days to survive. But for the Lakota and Cheyenne, that victory did not bring peace. When the camp left Little Bighorn on June 26th, thousands of people began separating into smaller groups. A large community needed too much grass for horses, too much buffalo meat, and too much water to remain in one place. Dispersing allowed them to move faster, but it also made each group easier for the army to locate and isolate. News of Custer's death reached the eastern United States during the nation's centennial celebrations. Instead of forcing the government to reconsider its Black Hills policy, the defeat produced demands for revenge. Congress, the Army, and the press called for a stronger campaign to end resistance on the Great Plains. During the final months of 1876, the Army sent more soldiers into Lakota and Cheyenne territory. Military units attacked winter camps, destroyed teepees, seized horses, and burned food supplies. The goal was not only to defeat warriors, but to make life outside the reservations impossible for entire communities. This was a war in which weather became a weapon. When families lost teepees, clothing, food, and horses during winter, they faced surrender or death from cold and hunger. The Army did not need one great victory if it could destroy the conditions required for continued movement. On November 25, 1876, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie attacked Dull Knife's Northern Cheyenne camp along the Powder River. Soldiers destroyed hundreds of teepees, seized horses, and burned food just before the severe winter began. The survivors had to walk through snow to seek shelter in Lakota camps. Little Bighorn had demonstrated the strength of a large community standing together. Later campaigns exposed the weakness of families forced to remain constantly on the move to avoid the Army. Every destroyed camp reduced the number of people still capable of fighting. In early 1877, many groups began arriving at government agencies to surrender. They did not come because they believed the government was right or because they had abandoned the Black Hills. They came because their horses were exhausted. Buffalo were harder to find, and children could not survive another winter of pursuit. Crazy Horse remained outside the reservation for months after Little Bighorn, but on May 6, 1877, he brought his people to surrender at Camp Robinson in present-day Nebraska. The man who had helped destroy Custer's force now lived under the supervision of the army he had fought. Only 4 months later, tensions between Crazy Horse and military officials increased. On September 5, 1877, soldiers tried to place him in confinement at Fort Robinson. A struggle followed, and he was stabbed with a bayonet. Crazy Horse died that night, at about 35 years old. Sitting Bull refused to surrender and led his people into Canada in 1877. For several years, they tried to preserve a free life north of the border. But buffalo herds declined, and the Canadian government would not support them indefinitely. On July 19, 1881, Sitting Bull returned to American territory and surrendered at Fort Buford. He was held as a prisoner of war and later transferred to the Standing Rock Reservation. For a short time, Sitting Bull appeared in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Audiences paid to see the man once treated as the symbol of resistance to Custer. The man called an enemy of America was displayed as part of a past America believed it had conquered. On December 15, 1890, government-controlled native police came to arrest Sitting Bull. Officials feared that he supported the ghost dance movement. A confrontation broke out outside his home at Standing Rock, killing Sitting Bull and several others. 14 years after Little Bighorn, one of the strongest voices against the seizure of Lakota land was killed on a reservation. 2 weeks later, on December 29, 1890, the Seventh Cavalry surrounded Minneconjou, Lakota near Wounded Knee Creek. When soldiers attempted to disarm the camp, gunfire erupted and hundreds of Lakota were killed. Many of the dead were women and children. The unit that lost Custer at Little Bighorn became linked to one of the darkest massacres in Western American history. Little Bighorn did not prevent the seizure of the Black Hills. In 1877, Congress passed a law taking the land from the Sioux. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty required approval from 3/4 of adult Sioux men. The collected signatures did not meet that requirement, yet the land was transferred to the United States. Gold towns and railroads rapidly transformed the Black Hills. Sacred places were excavated, divided, and renamed. The Lakota were forced onto smaller and drier lands while becoming dependent on government supplies. In less than a decade, the promise made in 1868 had almost completely disappeared from reality. The dispute did not end with the 19th century. On June 30, 1980, the United States Supreme Court upheld a ruling that the Black Hills had been taken illegally. The Sioux were entitled to compensation. The original payment and accumulated interest later grew enormously, but many Sioux representatives refused the money. They did not want to exchange the land for financial payment. To them, the issue had never been only about monetary value. Accepting the money could be interpreted as recognizing that the Black Hills had been legally sold. Their central demand remained their right to the land. More than a century after gold was found, the dispute sparked by Custer's expedition had still not truly ended. Those consequences remain visible at the Pine Ridge Reservation, home to many Oglala Lakota people. Poverty, housing shortages, health problems, and limited economic opportunity did not emerge from nothing. They are connected to generations of land loss, forced dependence, and policies designed to break community life. But Pine Ridge is not only a story of suffering. The Oglala Lakota continue to preserve their government ceremonies, family relationships, and Lakota language programs. After every policy intended to assimilate or erase them, the community still survives. This is what makes the outcome of Little Bighorn so bitter. The Lakota and Cheyenne won their greatest battle, but could not win the longer war against a wealthier government. The United States possessed more soldiers' resources and the ability to maintain pressure through every winter. The victory of June 25, 1876, protected the camp for only a short time. The Army failed to capture the village that day. But within 1 year, most people who had lived beside Little Bighorn were forced to surrender, disperse, or leave the country. The enormous community that once stretched for miles along the river was never assembled in that form again. Custer lost his battle in one afternoon. The Lakota and Cheyenne lost their homeland through years of campaigns, hunger, and coercion. That is the difference between winning on the battlefield and controlling what happens after the battle ends. Who has the right to tell the story of Little Bighorn? Return to the ridges east of the Little Bighorn River on June 27, 1876. Hundreds of bodies lay beneath the sun, while one wounded horse stood among the dead. Burial parties did not know where to begin. That was the image America received after the battle had ended. But the nation did not preserve that scene as it was. It placed Custer upright, put a sword in his hand, and arranged every soldier in a circle around him. A chaotic defeat became a heroic moment because mythology was more comforting than truth. The truth is that Custer had been warned. The scouts saw the size of the village Terry had not arrived, and Crook had been stopped at Rosebud. Custer still divided the regiment and entered a battle in which the enemy grew stronger with every passing minute. The truth is also that the people in the camp did not see themselves as rebels attacking the United States. They saw an army approaching after miners invaded the Black Hills, and the government abandoned its treaty obligations. To them, Little Bighorn was not an ambush against innocent men. It was the defense of their families against a force advancing into their homeland. What happened to the bodies after the battle remains horrifying, but calling it only savagery erases the wives, children, and families killed when Reno attacked the camp. Violence on those ridges did not begin after Custer died. No one knows for certain who shot or struck Custer down. It may have been an unknown warrior, or several people may have caused his final wounds. Buffalo Calf Road Woman may also have struck him, as Northern Cheyenne oral tradition relates. The final answer died with those standing near him, but that question may never have been the most important one. Knowing who killed Custer does not explain why he was at Little Bighorn. It does not explain why the Black Hills were invaded, or why the Lakota were called hostile on treaty-protected land. Focusing on the moment one man died can make people forget the system that brought thousands to the battlefield. Little Bighorn is not the story of one hero and a nameless crowd. It is the story of Custer, Reno, Benteen, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Gall, and Buffalo Calf Road Woman. It is also the story of Crow and Arikara scouts and thousands of families living beside the river. Each person entered June 25, 1876 for a different reason. Some fought because of orders, some fought for fame, and some fought because everything they loved was inside the teepees behind them. Today, white stone markers still stand on Last Stand Hill. Nearby, the Indian Memorial has finally restored names and voices to those who defended the camp. Two memories now share the same battlefield, but they do not tell the same story. One side honors the sacrifice of the soldiers. The other reminds us that those soldiers entered a community after the government had broken its promise. Both truths must exist together if Little Bighorn is to be told honestly. Custer died, but the system that brought him there continued to operate, and its consequences have not completely disappeared. That is the deepest truth of Little Bighorn. The battle did not end when the final gunshot echoed across the Montana grasslands. It continued through the seizure of the Black Hills, the reservations, and Wounded Knee. It continues in the Lakota struggle to preserve their land culture and memory. History once asked us to look up at the hill and mourn Custer. But before leaving, look down toward the river, where thousands of women, children, and elders camped in the summer of 1876. They were not background figures in the death of a famous man. They were the reason the battle happened. If this story changed how you see Little Bighorn, subscribe and share the detail that surprised you most. Behind every legend America created lies a truth buried in the ground, removed from books, or preserved by silenced voices. In the next story, we will uncover another truth that history tried to conceal for generations.